David Harrison vanished on March 15, 2023, while conducting research into a decades-old unsolved case that had captivated his attention for months. The 42-year-old history teacher from Millbrook High School in rural Ohio had spent his final evening at the local library, poring over newspaper archives and police records that dated back to 1987. When the librarian locked up that Tuesday night, David was still there, surrounded by yellowed documents and handwritten notes, completely absorbed in piecing together fragments of a mystery that most people in town had long forgotten. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty parking lot of Millbrook High School as students began arriving for another ordinary Wednesday. The familiar rhythm of backpacks hitting lockers and voices echoing through hallways filled the air, but something was different. Room 204, usually illuminated and welcoming by 7:30, remained dark. David Harrison's blue Honda Civic, which had occupied the same spot near the faculty entrance for 15 years, was nowhere to be seen. Sarah Chen, the substitute coordinator, received the first call at 7:45. Principal Margaret Foster's voice carried an unusual note of concern as she explained that David had failed to report for his morning classes. This was completely out of character for a man who had never missed a day without calling ahead, even when battling the flu 2 winters prior. The students in his first-period American history class sat restlessly as Sarah scrambled to find coverage, their teenage minds already spinning theories about their beloved teacher's absence. David had always been the kind of educator who arrived early and stayed late. His colleagues often joked that he treated the school like his second home, which wasn't far from the truth. Since his divorce 3 years earlier, David had thrown himself into his work with renewed passion. The walls of his classroom told the story of a man deeply committed to bringing history alive for his students. Maps from different eras covered every available surface, while carefully preserved artifacts from local historical societies occupied glass display cases he had purchased with his own money. The relationship David had built with his students went far beyond the typical teacher-student dynamic. He possessed a rare ability to make the past feel immediate and relevant. During lessons about the Great Depression, he would bring in photographs of local families from the 1930s, helping students understand that history wasn't just something that happened to other people in distant places. When teaching about the civil rights movement, he organized interviews with elderly community members who had witnessed those transformative decades firsthand. His teaching philosophy centered on encouraging students to question everything, to dig deeper, and to understand that official accounts didn't always tell the complete story. This approach had earned him respect from both students and parents, though it occasionally raised eyebrows among more conservative board members who preferred traditional textbook-based instruction. David believed that critical thinking was the most valuable gift he could give his students, preparing them not just for tests, but for citizenship in a complex world. The faculty break room buzzed with speculation as news of David's absence spread throughout the morning. Linda Martinez, who taught in the classroom next door, mentioned that she had noticed David staying increasingly late over the past several months. He would often still be there when she returned for evening events, his classroom glowing with the light from his desk lamp as he hunched over stacks of papers and old books. Jennifer Walsh, the librarian, had observed David's growing fascination with local historical research. What had started as preparation for a unit on regional history had evolved into something much more intensive. He had begun requesting access to archived newspapers from the 1980s, police reports from cold cases, and even old court documents that required special permission to view. His research had expanded beyond school hours, with David spending entire weekends at the county courthouse and state archives in Columbus. The transformation in David's behavior had been gradual but noticeable. Colleagues who had known him for years remarked that he seemed more focused, more driven, but also more isolated. He had always been somewhat solitary since his divorce, but lately he appeared completely consumed by whatever he was investigating. His lunch conversations, once filled with discussions about weekend plans or shared complaints about administrative policies, had shifted to questions about local families from decades past and requests for information about long-retired community members. Students had begun to notice changes in their teacher as well. While David's passion for history had always been evident, lately his lessons seemed to carry an undercurrent of something deeper. He would pause mid-sentence during discussions about investigative techniques, his eyes taking on a distant look as if he were connecting dots that only he could see. His assignments had begun incorporating more elements of research methodology and source verification, skills that seemed unusually sophisticated for a high school history class. The last person to see David was Margaret Thompson, the head librarian at the Millbrook Public Library. She had worked there for 37 years and prided herself on knowing every regular patron by name. David had become a fixture at the library over the past 4 months, arriving shortly after the school day ended and remaining until closing time. On that final Tuesday evening, Margaret remembered him being particularly focused, surrounded by materials he had requested from the archives. According to Margaret's recollection, David had filled an entire table with documents, creating what looked like a timeline with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes connected by colored string. He had asked her several questions about accessing older police records and had inquired about the process for requesting information through Freedom of Information Act requests. She remembered thinking it was unusual for a high school teacher to be conducting such thorough research, but David had always struck her as exceptionally dedicated to his craft. The discovery of David's research materials would not come until much later, but the foundation for that revelation had been building for months in plain sight. His classroom had gradually transformed into something resembling a detective's investigation room. Students who stayed after class for extra help had noticed new additions appearing regularly: photocopied newspaper headlines, printed photographs of people and places from decades past, and maps with locations marked in red ink. David's personal life had become increasingly intertwined with his research. His ex-wife, Carol, would later tell investigators that their occasional phone conversations about their shared custody schedule had become dominated by David's enthusiasm for historical mysteries. She described how he would launch into detailed explanations of inconsistencies he had discovered in official records, patterns that seemed suspicious, and connections that previous investigators had apparently missed. The case that had captured David's attention involved events from 1987, a time when many current residents of Millbrook were either children or had not yet moved to the area. This distance in time had initially made the investigation seem like a harmless academic exercise. Community members who remembered David as a thoughtful, methodical person assumed his research was simply an extension of his teaching, perhaps preparation for a book or documentary about local history. What none of them realized was how deeply David had become invested in uncovering what he believed was a significant injustice. His personal notebooks, which would eventually be discovered, revealed a man driven by a growing conviction that important facts had been overlooked or deliberately concealed. The methodical teacher who had once focused on lesson plans and grading papers had transformed into an amateur detective, working with the same careful attention to detail that had made him successful in the classroom. The empty parking space outside Millbrook High School on that Wednesday morning represented more than just an absent teacher. It marked the beginning of a mystery that would consume the small community for months to come, raising questions not only about David Harrison's whereabouts, but about the secrets that small towns keep and the price of seeking truth in places where some people prefer the past to remain buried. The silence in room 204 became deafening as Thursday morning arrived without any word from David Harrison. Principal Margaret Foster stood in the doorway of the empty classroom, her coffee growing cold as she surveyed the space that had become David's second home. His desk remained exactly as he had left it 2 days earlier, with a half-graded stack of essays on the American Revolution and a coffee mug bearing the faded logo of Ohio State University, his alma mater. The absence felt wrong in a way that transcended mere inconvenience, creating a hollow atmosphere that seemed to spread throughout the entire school. Sarah Chen had exhausted her list of available substitutes by noon on Wednesday, forcing her to divide David's classes among other history teachers who were already stretched thin with their own responsibilities. The students had initially welcomed the disruption to their routine, but as hours turned into days, their excitement transformed into genuine concern. David Harrison wasn't the type of teacher students hoped would be absent. He was the educator they looked forward to seeing, the one who made learning feel like solving mysteries rather than memorizing facts. By Friday, the whispers in hallways had evolved into full conversations about their missing teacher. Jessica Rodriguez, a senior in David's Advanced Placement American History class, approached Principal Foster during lunch with questions that reflected the maturity David had cultivated in his students. She wanted to know if the school had contacted authorities, whether David had family they should be worried about, and what would happen to their upcoming research projects. The concern in her voice echoed the sentiment throughout the school community. Principal Foster had been teaching and administrating for 23 years, but she had never faced a situation quite like this one. The standard protocol for teacher absences assumed temporary illness or family emergencies, not unexplained disappearances. She had spent Thursday morning making increasingly uncomfortable phone calls, starting with David's emergency contacts and gradually expanding to anyone who might have information about his whereabouts. Each conversation had yielded the same troubling result. Nobody had heard from David Harrison since Tuesday evening. The call to Carol Harrison, David's ex-wife, had been particularly difficult. Despite their divorce 3 years earlier, Carol had maintained an amicable relationship with David, especially regarding their shared concerns about his increasing isolation since the separation. She lived 40 minutes away in Columbus, working as a nurse at Ohio State University Medical Center, and had been expecting David's usual Sunday evening check-in call. When Principal Foster explained the situation, Carol's immediate response was to drive to Millbrook, her medical training making her acutely aware of how quickly unexplained absences could indicate serious problems. Detective Ray Morrison of the Millbrook Police Department had been a fixture in the community for 15 years, handling everything from minor traffic violations to the occasional domestic disturbance. Missing person cases were relatively rare in a town of just over 8,000 residents, where most people knew their neighbors and unusual behavior was quickly noticed. When Principal Foster filed the official report on Friday afternoon, Detective Morrison approached the case with the methodical thoroughness that had earned him respect throughout the county. The initial investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that painted David as a creature of absolute habit whose sudden deviation from routine was completely out of character. His landlord, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived in the downstairs unit of the duplex David rented, described him as quiet, punctual, and considerate. She had noticed that his car hadn't been in the driveway since Tuesday night, but had initially assumed he was staying elsewhere, perhaps visiting family. Mrs. Patterson's concern had grown when she realized that David's morning routine of retrieving his newspaper and starting his coffee maker hadn't occurred for 3 consecutive days. Detective Morrison's examination of David's apartment revealed a living space that reflected both order and obsession. The main living area had been converted into what could only be described as a research center. Maps of Millbrook and surrounding counties covered the walls, marked with colored pins and connected by lengths of string. Tables held carefully organized stacks of photocopied documents, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes that demonstrated the systematic approach David applied to everything in his life. His laptop computer remained open on the dining table, displaying browser tabs related to public record searches and genealogy websites. The apartment's transformation told the story of a man who had become completely absorbed in his investigation. Books about investigative techniques occupied shelf space normally reserved for the historical biographies David had always favored. His refrigerator door displayed a timeline he had constructed, featuring dates, names, and locations from 1987, alongside question marks and arrows, indicating connections he was still exploring. The methodical teacher had applied his educational skills to detective work, creating a comprehensive filing system that rivaled anything Detective Morrison had seen in professional investigations. David's financial records provided no clues about his disappearance. His bank account showed regular deposits from the school district and modest withdrawals for everyday expenses. There had been no large purchases, no travel reservations, and no unusual activity that might indicate planned departure. His credit cards remained unused since Tuesday afternoon, when he had purchased coffee and a sandwich at the cafe across from the library. His cell phone had gone straight to voicemail since Wednesday morning, with the last tracked location being the Millbrook Public Library on Tuesday at closing time. The search for David's Honda Civic expanded throughout the weekend, as volunteers from the school community joined law enforcement in checking parking lots, roadside areas, and any location where an abandoned vehicle might be overlooked. Linda Martinez organized teams of teachers and parents who methodically covered every street in Millbrook, while students created and distributed missing person flyers featuring David's photograph and contact information for Detective Morrison. The community response demonstrated the impact David had made during his 15 years of teaching, with former students returning from colleges across Ohio to participate in the search efforts. Margaret Thompson, the librarian who had been the last person to see David, provided Detective Morrison with detailed information about his recent research activities. She described how David's inquiries had evolved from general historical interest to focused investigation of specific individuals and events from 1987. He had requested access to archived newspapers from surrounding counties, court records from cases that had been closed decades earlier, and even marriage and death certificates that required special authorization to obtain. Margaret had been impressed by David's thoroughness, but had begun to wonder about the intensity of his focus. The investigation into David's research revealed that he had been exploring a case involving the disappearance of a young woman named Patricia Kellerman in the summer of 1987. Patricia had been 24 years old, working as a secretary at the county courthouse when she vanished after leaving work on a Friday evening. Her car had been found 3 days later in a parking lot at a state park 15 miles from Millbrook, but Patricia herself was never located. The case had received significant attention initially, but without solid leads or evidence, it had gradually faded from public consciousness. David's notes indicated that he had identified several inconsistencies in the official investigation of Patricia's disappearance. He had discovered discrepancies between witness statements and police reports, timeline gaps that had never been adequately explained, and what appeared to be incomplete follow-up on potentially important leads. His research had led him to interview elderly residents who remembered Patricia and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, many of whom had shared information that had never been included in the official case file. The connection between David's current research and Patricia Kellerman's decades-old case raised questions that Detective Morrison found both intriguing and concerning. David's investigation had apparently uncovered information that cast doubt on the thoroughness of the original police work, potentially implicating individuals who still lived in the community. His notes referenced several prominent local figures from 1987, including business owners, government officials, and even law enforcement personnel who had been involved in the initial investigation. As the second week of David's absence began, the atmosphere at Millbrook High School had shifted from concern to something approaching grief. Students struggled to concentrate on lessons taught by substitutes who lacked David's ability to make history come alive. The advanced placement students worried about their upcoming exams, knowing that their preparation had been disrupted at a crucial time. Teachers found themselves answering questions they couldn't answer, trying to provide comfort, while battling their own fears about what might have happened to their colleague. Carol Harrison had taken temporary leave from her nursing position to coordinate search efforts and serve as liaison with Detective Morrison's investigation. Her conversations with David's colleagues revealed the extent to which his personality had changed in recent months. While he had always been dedicated to his work, his recent behavior suggested something closer to obsession. Fellow teachers described a man who seemed driven by urgency, as if he believed time was running out to uncover information that others wanted to keep buried. The community's initial unity in searching for David began to fracture, as details about his research became public knowledge. Some residents expressed discomfort with the idea that David had been investigating events from their past, particularly a case that had caused significant pain for Patricia Kellerman's family and friends. Others questioned whether a high school teacher had any business conducting what amounted to amateur detective work on matters that professional law enforcement had been unable to resolve. Local business owners whose names appeared in David's research files expressed frustration with what they characterized as unfounded speculation about decades-old events. Several individuals contacted Detective Morrison to voice concerns about having their reputations questioned based on the theories of a missing person whose own credibility they now questioned. The investigation was creating divisions in a community that had initially come together to search for one of their own. As March drew to a close, Detective Morrison found himself investigating not only David Harrison's disappearance, but also the 1987 case that had consumed the missing teacher's attention. The two investigations had become intertwined in ways that made it impossible to understand one without exploring the other. David's research had raised legitimate questions about the original handling of Patricia Kellerman's case, but it had also created new mysteries about what had motivated his sudden disappearance and whether his investigation had uncovered something dangerous. The pressure on Detective Morrison intensified as media attention began to focus on the case. Local television stations from Columbus and Dayton sent reporters to Millbrook, drawn by the compelling story of a dedicated teacher who had vanished while investigating a cold case. The coverage brought unwanted scrutiny to a community that valued its privacy, and several residents expressed frustration with what they perceived as sensationalized reporting that painted their town in an unfavorable light. Among those most affected by the media attention was Patricia Kellerman's younger sister, Rebecca, who still lived in the area and worked as a nurse practitioner at the regional medical center. Rebecca had spent 36 years wondering what had happened to her sister, carrying the weight of unanswered questions that had shaped her entire adult life. David's research had reopened wounds that had never properly healed, bringing back memories of the helplessness she had felt as a 19-year-old watching her family slowly disintegrate under the strain of not knowing. Detective Morrison's interview with Rebecca revealed the complex emotions surrounding David's investigation. While she appreciated his efforts to bring attention to Patricia's case, she worried about the impact on her elderly parents, who had never recovered from their daughter's disappearance. Her father had developed heart problems that doctors attributed partly to the chronic stress of his unresolved grief, and her mother had struggled with anxiety and depression for decades. The renewed attention to Patricia's case had caused both parents to relapse into the despair that had consumed them in the years immediately following their daughter's disappearance. The detective's review of the original 1987 investigation files revealed the limitations that had hampered the initial search for Patricia. The Millbrook Police Department of that era had consisted of only 4 full-time officers led by Chief Robert McAllister, a man whose experience had been limited primarily to traffic violations and minor property crimes. When Patricia disappeared, the department had been overwhelmed by the complexity of a missing person case that quickly expanded beyond their capabilities. State police had been called in to assist, but coordination between agencies had been poor, resulting in duplicated efforts and overlooked leads. David's research had identified specific failures in the original investigation that professional law enforcement had missed or chosen to ignore. His notes documented witnesses who had never been interviewed, physical evidence that had been inadequately processed, and potential suspects who had been eliminated from consideration without thorough investigation. Most troubling were his discoveries about influential community members who appeared to have received preferential treatment during the investigation. Their alibis accepted without the same scrutiny applied to other potential suspects. The political dimensions of David's research became apparent as Detective Morrison delved deeper into the materials found in the teacher's apartment. Several individuals mentioned in David's notes held prominent positions in the community during the 1980s and had since built successful careers in business and local government. These included Thomas Mitchell, who had served as mayor from 1985 to 1995 and now owned the largest construction company in the county, and Dr. Franklin Weber, who had been the county coroner in 1987 and continued to hold that position despite being well past retirement age. David's investigation had also focused attention on retired police officers from the original investigation, including former Detective Lieutenant Joseph Camden, who had been the primary investigator assigned to Patricia's case. Camden had retired in 1998 after a controversial career that included several complaints about his investigative methods and his handling of evidence. David's notes suggested that Camden had been less than thorough in his investigation of Patricia's disappearance, possibly due to personal relationships with some of the individuals who should have been considered suspects. The scope of David's research extended beyond the immediate circumstances of Patricia's disappearance to include a broader pattern of cases from the same time period that had been inadequately investigated. He had identified 3 other missing person cases from the late 1980s in surrounding counties that shared disturbing similarities with Patricia's situation. All involved young women in their 20s, all had cars that were found abandoned in remote locations, and all had investigations that seemed to lose momentum after initial inquiries failed to produce immediate results. Detective Morrison's attempts to interview individuals mentioned in David's research met with varying degrees of cooperation. Some longtime residents were eager to share their memories of Patricia and the impact her disappearance had on the community. Others were defensive about questions that seemed to challenge the official version of events from decades past. A few individuals refused to discuss the matter entirely, citing their desire to avoid involvement in what they characterized as speculation based on incomplete information. The investigation revealed that David had been in contact with retired FBI agents who specialized in cold cases, seeking their expertise in analyzing the evidence he had compiled. Agent Martha Rodriguez, who had worked missing person cases in Ohio during the 1990s, confirmed that David had reached out to her 3 weeks before his disappearance. She described him as thorough and methodical, with a genuine commitment to finding answers rather than simply creating theories. Agent Rodriguez had been impressed enough with David's research to agree to review his findings, but their scheduled meeting had never taken place due to his disappearance. As April arrived, the search for David Harrison had expanded to include neighboring states, with law enforcement agencies in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky alerted to watch for his vehicle and personal identification. The FBI had been consulted about the possibility that David's disappearance was connected to his investigation, though no formal federal involvement had been requested. The case remained officially classified as a missing person investigation, though Detective Morrison privately acknowledged that the circumstances suggested something more complex than a simple disappearance. The emotional toll on Millbrook High School continued to mount as students and faculty struggled to maintain normal routines while grappling with the uncertainty surrounding their missing colleague. Counselors from the district office had been brought in to help students process their feelings about David's absence, but many found it difficult to concentrate on academic work while wondering whether their teacher was safe. The advanced placement students faced particular challenges, with their exam preparations disrupted at a crucial time in their senior year. The mystery of David Harrison's disappearance had transformed from a local concern into a regional news story that raised uncomfortable questions about small-town secrets and the price of seeking truth. As spring flowers began to bloom in Millbrook, the community found itself divided between those who supported David's quest for answers and those who believed some questions were better left unasked. The teacher who had always encouraged his students to dig deeper into history had discovered that some people preferred the past to remain buried, and his pursuit of truth had led him into a silence that seemed to grow more profound with each passing day. The legacy of David Harrison's investigation extended beyond the specific crimes he had been. 8 months after David Harrison's disappearance, maintenance worker Miguel Santos was preparing room 204 for the new school year when he made a discovery that would finally shed light on the mystery that had haunted Millbrook High School. The August heat was stifling as Miguel worked alone in the classroom, carefully removing David's remaining personal items from the old wooden desk that had served countless teachers over its 40-year history. As he pulled out the bottom drawer completely to clean behind it, Miguel noticed something unusual about the desk's construction. There appeared to be a hidden compartment built into the back panel, accessible only when the drawer was fully removed. Inside the concealed space, Miguel found a manila envelope sealed with tape and marked with David's distinctive handwriting. The words, "In case something happens to me," were written across the front in blue ink, followed by Detective Morrison's name and phone number. Miguel's hands trembled slightly as he realized the significance of his discovery. After 8 months of unanswered questions, here was potentially the key to understanding what had happened to the beloved history teacher who had simply vanished without explanation. Detective Morrison arrived at the school within 30 minutes of Miguel's call, accompanied by Principal Foster and the district's legal counsel. The envelope contained materials that immediately validated the investigative work David had been conducting in secret. Photographs, documents, and handwritten notes revealed the depth of his research into Patricia Kellerman's 1987 disappearance. But more importantly, they contained evidence that David believed he had identified the person responsible for Patricia's fate. The most significant item in the envelope was a detailed letter David had written to Detective Morrison, dated just 3 days before his disappearance. In the letter, David explained that his investigation had led him to believe that Patricia Kellerman had not simply disappeared, but had been harmed by someone with significant influence in the community. He had discovered inconsistencies in official statements, witness testimonies that had been ignored, and physical evidence that had been mishandled or overlooked entirely. David's letter revealed that he had been in contact with Patricia's sister, Rebecca, sharing his findings and seeking her input on details that only family members would remember. Rebecca had provided David with information about Patricia's state of mind in the weeks before her disappearance, including concerns she had expressed about feeling followed and receiving unwanted attention from someone she refused to identify. This information had never been included in the original police reports, suggesting that Rebecca had either not been thoroughly interviewed or that her statements had been dismissed as irrelevant. The envelope also contained copies of documents David had obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, including police reports, witness statements, and evidence logs from the original investigation. David's meticulous analysis had identified numerous gaps and inconsistencies that painted a picture of an investigation that had been either incompetent or deliberately misdirected. His notes indicated that certain leads had been ignored, key witnesses had not been interviewed, and physical evidence had been processed inadequately or lost entirely. Most damaging were David's discoveries about the timeline of Patricia's disappearance and the alibis provided by several individuals who had been considered suspects. David had traced the movements of these individuals through credit card records, employment schedules, and witness accounts, revealing discrepancies that cast doubt on their stated whereabouts during the critical time period. His research suggested that at least one person had provided false information to police, and that this deception had been accepted without proper verification. The envelope contained photographs that David had somehow obtained from the original crime scene, including images of Patricia's abandoned car and the surrounding area. David's analysis of these photographs had identified details that appeared to have been overlooked by the original investigators. He had noted inconsistencies in the positioning of items inside the car, tire tracks that suggested the vehicle had been moved after Patricia left it, and other physical evidence that supported his theory that the scene had been staged to mislead investigators. David's research had also uncovered connections between Patricia's case and other unsolved disappearances from the same time period. His notes documented similarities between Patricia's situation and 3 other cases involving young women who had vanished under mysterious circumstances in surrounding counties during the late 1980s. David believed these cases were connected, and that the failure to identify these connections had allowed a dangerous individual to avoid detection for decades. The letter revealed that David had been planning to present his findings to state police investigators, bypassing local law enforcement due to his concerns about potential conflicts of interest. He had been scheduled to meet with Detective Lieutenant Sarah Hoffman of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation on March 18th, just 3 days after his own disappearance. David had specifically requested this meeting because Detective Hoffman specialized in cold cases and had a reputation for thoroughness that David believed was lacking in the original investigation. Detective Morrison's review of David's materials revealed the teacher's growing concern about his own safety as his investigation progressed. David's notes from his final weeks indicated that he believed someone was aware of his research and was attempting to intimidate him into abandoning the case. He had documented several incidents that suggested surveillance, including cars that seemed to follow him home from the library, hang-up phone calls at unusual hours, and the feeling that his apartment had been searched while he was at work. The envelope also contained a copy of a letter David had written to his ex-wife Carol, to be delivered only in the event of his disappearance or harm. In this deeply personal document, David apologized for the risks he had taken and explained his conviction that seeking justice for Patricia Kellerman was worth the potential dangers. He had asked Carol to ensure that his research reached the appropriate authorities and to continue advocating for a proper investigation into Patricia's case. David's final notes revealed his growing certainty about the identity of Patricia's attacker, though he had been careful not to make direct accusations without absolute proof. His research had focused increasingly on one individual whose movements and behavior during the critical time period could not be adequately explained. This person had provided an alibi that David's investigation had revealed to be false, and had subsequently taken actions that suggested knowledge of details about Patricia's disappearance that had never been made public. The individual David suspected was Thomas Mitchell, the former mayor who now owned the county's largest construction company. David's research had revealed that Mitchell had been questioned during the original investigation, but had been quickly eliminated as a suspect, based on an alibi provided by business associates. David's subsequent investigation had discovered that these associates had financial relationships with Mitchell that created potential conflicts of interest, and that their statements about his whereabouts had never been independently verified. David's notes documented Mitchell's behavior in the months following Patricia's disappearance, including his sudden decision to relocate his business operations and his apparent efforts to distance himself from any connection to the case. Mitchell had also been involved in several real estate transactions during this period that David found suspicious, including the purchase of property near the location where Patricia's car had been found. David believed these actions suggested knowledge of the case that extended beyond what had been reported in the media. The envelope contained evidence that David had been building a comprehensive case against Mitchell, including financial records, property transactions, and witness statements that contradicted the former mayor's official account of his activities. David had also discovered that Mitchell had been involved in other situations, involving young women, that had resulted in complaints that were subsequently withdrawn or dismissed. These incidents suggested a pattern of behavior that David believed was consistent with the circumstances surrounding Patricia's disappearance. Detective Morrison's analysis of David's materials revealed the sophisticated nature of the teacher's investigation and the legitimate concerns that had motivated his research. David had approached the case with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to his classroom teaching, carefully documenting every lead and verifying every piece of information before drawing conclusions. His work demonstrated a level of investigative skill that rivaled professional law enforcement, and his findings raised serious questions about the adequacy of the original investigation. The discovery of David's hidden materials also revealed the extent to which he had been working in isolation, apparently afraid to share his findings with local law enforcement due to concerns about potential corruption or incompetence. His decision to hide the evidence in his classroom desk suggested that he had been planning for the possibility that something might happen to him before he could present his case to state authorities. The fact that he had prepared detailed documentation for others to find indicated his commitment to ensuring that Patricia's case would not be forgotten, even if he were unable to continue his investigation. The revelation of David's research created immediate complications for Detective Morrison's investigation into the teacher's disappearance. The materials provided a clear motive for someone to want to silence David, but they also raised questions about the timing and circumstances of his vanishing. If David had indeed uncovered evidence of serious crimes, his disappearance took on a much more sinister character than a simple missing person case. The envelope also contained David's analysis of potential dangers he faced as his investigation progressed. He had documented his growing awareness that certain individuals in the community were monitoring his activities, and his concern that his research was creating risks for himself and others. David's notes revealed his internal struggle between his commitment to seeking justice for Patricia and his recognition that his investigation was potentially putting him in danger. Principal Foster's reaction to the discovery was one of profound sadness mixed with admiration for David's dedication to uncovering the truth. She realized that the colleague she had known and respected for 15 years had been conducting a secret investigation that demonstrated both his courage and his commitment to justice. The discovery also explained many of the behavioral changes that staff members had noticed in David's final months, revealing that his increased intensity and isolation had been the result of carrying the burden of potentially explosive information. The school district's legal counsel immediately recognized the implications of David's discovery and the potential liability issues surrounding a teacher who had been conducting an unofficial investigation into serious crimes. The revelation that David had been using school resources and time for his research raised questions about the district's responsibility and the appropriate response to his findings. The council recommended immediate cooperation with law enforcement while protecting the district from potential legal complications. As news of the discovery spread through Millbrook, the community found itself grappling with the possibility that David Harrison had not simply disappeared, but had been silenced because of his investigation into a decades-old crime. The revelation transformed the narrative surrounding David's case from a mysterious disappearance into a potential conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local society. The teacher, who had always encouraged his students to question official accounts, had apparently uncovered information that someone had been willing to eliminate him to protect. The implications of David's research extended far beyond his own disappearance, calling into question the integrity of the original investigation and the competence or honesty of those who had been responsible for finding Patricia Kellerman. Detective Morrison found himself facing the uncomfortable reality that his predecessor's work might have been fundamentally flawed, either through incompetence or deliberate misdirection. The discovery forced him to confront the possibility that respected members of the community had been involved in covering up serious crimes for decades. Thomas Mitchell's reaction to the revelation of David's suspicions was swift and aggressive. Through his attorney, Mitchell issued a statement denying any involvement in Patricia Kellerman's disappearance and characterizing David's investigation as the work of an unstable individual who had become obsessed with conspiracy theories. Mitchell claimed that his elimination as a suspect in the original investigation had been based on solid evidence and proper police work, and he threatened legal action against anyone who repeated David's allegations without proof. The former mayor's aggressive response only served to intensify scrutiny of his role in the events of 1987. Detective Morrison's review of the original investigation files revealed that Mitchell's alibi had indeed been accepted with minimal verification, based primarily on statements from business associates who had financial incentives to protect their relationship with the politically powerful contractor. The detectives' attempts to re-interview these individuals met with resistance, as several claimed to no longer remember the specific details of events from decades earlier. Rebecca Kellerman found herself thrust back into the painful spotlight she had tried to avoid for 36 years. David's research had validated many of the concerns she had expressed to police in 1987, concerns that had apparently been dismissed or ignored by investigators who preferred simpler explanations for her sister's disappearance. Rebecca's decision to cooperate with David's investigation had been motivated by her frustration with the official case's lack of progress, but she now wondered whether her assistance had somehow contributed to David's own fate. The revelation of David's findings prompted Detective Lieutenant Sarah Hoffman of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation to finally review the case that David had planned to present to her. Hoffman's analysis of the materials found in the hidden compartment confirmed that David had identified legitimate inconsistencies and gaps in the original investigation. Her preliminary review suggested that the case warranted reopening, not only to investigate Patricia's disappearance, but also to determine whether David's own vanishing was connected to his research. The media attention surrounding the discovery of David's hidden evidence transformed the story from a local mystery into a regional scandal. Television stations from Columbus, Cleveland, and Cincinnati sent reporters to Millbrook, drawn by the compelling narrative of a teacher who had potentially solved a cold case only to disappear himself. The coverage brought unwanted scrutiny to a community that had hoped David's case would quietly fade from public attention, and several prominent residents expressed anger about having their reputations questioned based on decades-old allegations. The school district faced difficult decisions about how to handle the classroom where David's evidence had been hidden, and the legacy of a teacher whose dedication to truth had apparently cost him his life. Principal Foster struggled with balancing respect for David's memory with the need to maintain a learning environment that wasn't overshadowed by tragedy and conspiracy. Some parents questioned whether their children should continue attending a school where such dark events had unfolded, while others argued that David's commitment to seeking justice represented the best values the district could teach. Carol Harrison's response to learning about her ex-husband's final letter was a mixture of grief, pride, and anger. She was devastated to realize that David had been carrying such a heavy burden alone in his final months, and proud of his courage in pursuing justice despite the personal risks. Her anger was directed at those who might have harmed David and at herself for not recognizing the signs that he was in danger. Carol became a vocal advocate for continuing David's investigation and ensuring that his work would not be forgotten. Detective Morrison's investigation into David's disappearance took on new urgency, as the evidence suggested that the teacher might have been eliminated to prevent him from exposing serious crimes. The detective began working with state investigators to review not only David's research, but also the circumstances of his vanishing. The investigation expanded to include surveillance of individuals mentioned in David's notes and analysis of their activities around the time of his disappearance. The discovery of David's evidence also raised questions about other unsolved cases from the 1980s that he had identified as potentially connected to Patricia's disappearance. Law enforcement agencies in surrounding counties were contacted to review their files and determine whether David's theories about a pattern of crimes had merit. The possibility that a serial offender had been operating in the region for decades without detection created pressure for a comprehensive review of all related cases. Thomas Mitchell's business operations came under increased scrutiny as investigators examined the property transactions and financial records that David had identified as suspicious. The former mayor's construction company had been involved in numerous projects throughout the region, including some in areas where other disappearances had occurred. Mitchell's access to heavy equipment and remote construction sites raised uncomfortable questions about his potential involvement in disposing of evidence or concealing crimes. The psychological profile that emerged from David's investigation painted a picture of someone who had used his political position and business connections to avoid proper scrutiny during the original investigation. David's notes suggested that Mitchell had been able to manipulate the investigation through his relationships with key figures in local law enforcement and government. The teacher's research had revealed a network of mutual dependencies and conflicts of interest that had compromised the integrity of the criminal justice process. The impact on Millbrook High School continued to reverberate as students and faculty processed the revelation that their missing teacher had been conducting a dangerous investigation in secret. Many students felt a renewed connection to David's memory, seeing his pursuit of truth as an extension of the critical thinking skills he had tried to teach them. Others struggled with the realization that their safe school environment had been the center of such dark events. The community's response to the discovery reflected deeper divisions about truth, justice, and the price of disturbing long-buried secrets. Some residents supported David's investigation and called for a complete review of the original case, while others argued that reopening decades-old wounds served no useful purpose. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about whether seeking justice was worth the disruption and pain it caused to families and institutions. As autumn arrived in Millbrook, the investigation into both Patricia Kellerman's 1987 disappearance and David Harrison's 2023 vanishing continued to expand. State investigators had taken over both cases, working to determine whether David's theories about the connection between the two events were accurate. The discovery in the hidden compartment had provided the breakthrough that Detective Morrison had hoped for, but it had also opened new questions about the depth of corruption and conspiracy that might have been operating in their small community for decades. The legacy of David Harrison's investigation extended beyond the specific crimes he had been researching to encompass broader questions about institutional integrity and the courage required to seek truth in the face of powerful opposition. His hidden evidence had provided the key to understanding both his own fate and the injustices he had been fighting to expose, ensuring that his final lesson about the importance of questioning authority and seeking truth would not be forgotten by those who had the courage to continue his work.